Okay, Brittany, you have to unshare your screen.
Yep. There we go.
All right. Let me do that and let me share. And hopefully you can see this. And good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. My name is Ed Gutkowski, and as Brittany had mentioned, I am the Chief Architect of RapidReconciler, and I'll be guiding you through today's session on distribution manufacturing AAIs. Okay, so here basically the topics we're going to cover. It's how DMAAIs work. We'll talk a little bit about the setup screen. So how do you get to it? How do you set up a DMAAI? What does it look like? And then after we talk about that and how they work, we're going to talk about some wildcard entries. So you'll get used to the term, what is a wildcard when we're talking about DMAAIs, and how does JD Edwards interpret those wildcards. From an informational perspective, we have a listing of some of the tables, the DMAAI tables, what they're used for, and the programs that actually invoke them. So we'll talk a little bit about that. That's a pretty big listing, and it's provided for informational purposes. You'll be able to get a hold of a copy of this presentation if you want. We'll talk about how line types on sales orders and purchase orders get impacted with DMAAIs and some of the options that are available there. And then finally, we'll cover some tips and tricks. So if you are responsible for managing your DMAAIs, you might want to pay attention during that section. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how DMAAIs actually work. So my assumption is that the folks that are on this session today are running JD Edwards, and you have inventory that you manage. So with that inventory comes all various kinds of transactions. So you can be doing things such as purchase order receipts, shipment to sales orders, issuing materials to work orders, doing work order completions, and the such. I'm gonna give you a little bit of a hint on how old I am. I remember back in the day when inventory was being managed and you had an ERP system and you needed to get some inventory to do something. And so you'd go down to the crib. What you'd have to do is you'd have to get one of these punch cards, and you'd fill out one of these cards or have it done. You'd go down, they'd give you the inventory. Then you would have to take this punch card and you would walk it over to the accounting group. You'd have to drop the punch card off, and then they would go ahead, and what they would do is they would make entries in the general ledger based on the information that was contained on the punch card. So again, I am dating myself. This was probably happening back in the 70s and 80s, okay? Now, with more automated ERP systems such as JD Edwards, what happened was these punch cards are now replaced by something called DMAAIs, or distribution manufacturing automatic accounting instructions. So that group of people who used to collect the punch cards and then turn around and manually key transactions into the general ledger, well, they don't have to do that anymore. That's the purpose of DMAAIs. So a DMAAI in JD Edwards is a roadmap between an inventory transaction and the journal entry. So you might go on a screen, or if you have barcode systems, you might do a transaction on a barcode gun. But when you do that transaction, automatically in the system, the corresponding journal entry is created, and the mapping that's used to know what accounts get updated for that entry, that's what the DMAAIs are for. Okay, so just a simple example of how they work. Let's say that we're going to do an inventory adjustment, so just an IA. So behind the menu, when you go to execute that transaction, there is a program that runs. So the JD Edwards program number in this case is P4114. So if I go on the menu and I find the option that says enter an inventory adjustment and I select it, this is the program that gets invoked. Okay. So once you fill out the branch plan item, all the information, the quantity, etc., and you hit enter, that's when it goes out. This program now will go to the DMAAI tables And the actual tables that get called are hard-coded within the programs. So an inventory adjustment will use 4122, 4124. A purchase order receipt will use a different set of tables. A sales order shipment will use different ones, so on and so forth. Okay, so the transactions are hard-coded with the table numbers. You will go into JD Edwards. This is kind of what a DMAAI table looks like. I know it's small, probably hard to see. Okay, but you'll get the idea. And then once it gets that, it knows what to do. So then the general ledger entries are created automatically. So we'll have a debit to one of the tables, you'll have a credit to the other. Okay, so typically it's balance sheet, P&L statement. Okay, but the journal entries are automatic. No additional manpower is required to make that happen. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how we set up DMAAIs. So if you have the authority, and very few people have authority in a typical organization, but to get there, if you have FastPath, you can type DMAAI. Okay, the program number, I believe, is 4095. The data is stored in table F495. So if you're a report writer and you want to know where the information is inside the JD Edwards database, it's in table F4095. Okay, if you have access and you get to the work with AAI screen, you will be able to skip to whatever table you want. Learning what the tables are and what they do, that is experience. You just need to be experienced with them. You get to learn them over time. It's not something where you can sit down for an hour and have these things figured out. They are quite complex. There are lots of DMAAI tables, as you see as we go forward in the presentation. Okay, so that's what the initial screen looks like. Once you select one of the options, it gets a little bit more detailed. So you'll see some of the columns that are here. If you're going to add a new record, you would add a company, a document type, a GL category code, and then you put in the accounting information. So you'll enter a branch or business unit, an object, and a subsidiary for the account number. Okay, so that's what's keyed in. Now, the account number, when you enter them in, the account numbers are not validated. Okay, so this program does not go to the account master and say, this account doesn't really work for me, right? It's not been set up in our chart of accounts. You know, none of that happens here, and there is a reason for that. And the reason is because of things called flex accounting, where you can leave either the business unit piece or the subsidiary piece blank. Okay, and there are other more advanced setups behind the scene where you can flex in the values based on parameters of the transactions. Okay, so there's that. Now, also the key to this, when you enter, and by key, I mean what makes one of these rows unique. It's going to be a combination of company, document type, and GL class code. Okay, so those three fields are critical and you cannot list them more than once. Okay, so you cannot make a duplicate entry. So a combination of one company number, one document type, one GL category code gets you one account number, okay, one full account number. Okay, now notice that I have two entries circled here. One, under the company number, you see in some of these entries here, you'll have company number 00000. We call that a wildcard for company number. And in the GL category, you can have 4 asterisks, like is shown here. That is a wildcard, and we're going to talk about that on the next slide. So you can have wildcards for companies, you can have wildcard for GL category code. You can't have a wildcard for any of the account segments, okay? They either have to be blanks or they're going to have to be a value. You can't have something that means, whatever, okay? All right, so let's talk a little bit about the wildcards. So use of wildcards, the company number, the 5 zeros, and the 4 asterisks, okay? So what JD Edwards does with any inventory transaction, and when it goes to the DMAAIs, it's going to look for a specific company number. So if I'm doing a transaction, say in company number 1, I'm going to go first, and for any table that has entries in it, I am going to try to find all the entries for company one. Okay. Then it's going to be based on the document type. So for example, if I'm doing an inventory adjustment and my document type is IA, well, it's going to go, I want to see an exact match for company one for document type IA. Then I'm going to use that, and I'll use the geo class code. I find that, I match all three. That's the account number I'm going to use for that transaction. Okay. If not, it goes through what we call hierarchy. So there's a succession of things that it tries before it gives up. So let's talk about that. Okay. So I'm going to use an example here for company 100 with a geo class of IN20. Okay. And this is, we'll talk about for an inventory adjustment. What's it going to do? Well, the first thing it's going to do is look for an exact match. So do I find an entry with company 00100 and geo class IN20? Okay, if I find that exact match, then hallelujah, that's the one I'll use. But if I don't just automatically error out. I go through a second lookup. And the second lookup says, now I'm going to try to find a match exact company number, but the geo class has a wildcard. So that means that, well, if I don't specify the IN20, then it means, well, I don't really care what the geo class is. If it's a company 100 IA, I'm going to use the account associated with this setup. Okay. Now, if it can't find an entry for company 100 with the 4 asterisks, do I error at this point? And the answer is nope. I still have another step that I try. I say, can I find a company 0 entry with a geo class of IN20, an exact match here, right? And if I do, I'll use that. But if I don't, guess what? I go through a 4th lookup. Do I find something that has a company 0 and a geo class of asterisk? So wildcard, right? So exact match, wildcard GL, wildcard company exact match on the GL, and wildcard. So it does a lot of searching before finally, when it gets through all 4 of these and it still can't find a match, that's when you start getting those dreaded error messages. So sometimes on a transaction screen, if you're doing a PO receipt, an inventory adjustment or the like, and you start to you enter all this information for that transaction, and you hit enter, that's when you'll get the red on the screen and it'll say DMAAI error. And it will tell you what the table number is and what is wrong with the transaction and that you're missing a setup. Okay. Now, usually when JD Edwards is first set up in a company and all the testing is done, all these combinations are all tested out. But as time goes on and new geo class codes are introduced into your process or new company numbers are set up, okay, not everything may be set up accordingly and you may find yourself running into these errors. Okay, so pay attention. Okay, the company number, geo class exact match, company match, geo class wildcard, company wildcard, geo class match, and then wildcard, right? And the reason I'm asking you to pay attention is because now we have a little bit of a poll quiz here. Okay, so if I'm going to do this inventory adjustment for an IA transaction in company 1 for an item with geo class IN20, which one of these DMAIs will be used? Okay, so now, and Brittany, I don't know if you can still hear me, but I don't see where I can launch the poll question here.
I can still hear you, yeah.
Do you know where it is I launched the poll question from?
Yeah, if you down where like the Q&A session is and you can see participants, there's a poll.
Okay.
Down at the bottom, just click that.
Participants. I don't see any poll thing. Oh, well, I don't see anything.
I'm happy to add it.
Yeah, if we can launch it, that'd be great. I just don't want to spend too much time on it because I'll just work around it.
Okay.
All right. So if you were paying attention and you look over all these answers, the answer is number 3. Okay, so the question was for an inventory adjustment IA in company number 1 for an item with a GL class of IN20, which one of these will be used? So it's company 1, IN20. Well, if we look at anything, the first thing that it does is it matches on company, right? So that will automatically rule out numbers 1 and 2. Okay, we have a GL class code of IN20. Well, in the bottom 2, there is no exact match, so it will go to the GL class of wildcard. Okay, so I'm hoping that you get the purpose of the hierarchy, and the reason that wildcards are around is because it does save a lot of typing. Okay, so you can, if you think about it and put your mind to it, you can use wildcards in a way that it would save you a lot of data entry when it comes to setting up your AAIs. Now, being an experienced consultant as far as JD Edwards is concerned in setting up DMAAIs, I am not a big fan of the wildcards. They do have their uses in particular instances, like if you're doing transfer orders and everything flows through one account, you can put, for company 1, you can say all GL class codes go to this particular account because that's my goods in transit account. Well, there's a perfect use of the asterisks, okay? An example of something where I would not recommend that you use wildcards would be something like sales orders and sales order processing, so the ship confirmed transaction. Now, a lot of times when people set this up, what I find very strange is that one assumes that if I'm shipping something out, it's a finished goods. And a lot of companies will segregate their inventory by geo class code, meaning that they'll have one geo class code that means raw materials, one that means subassembly, one that means finished goods. Okay, and if I have a sales order, they're saying, well, I don't really care what the geo class code is on an item that's on a sales order. We know that that's a finished good, and when I ship this out, I want to credit the finished goods inventory account. Well, if you do that, you're just asking for trouble because it's not always a finished good that gets shipped out on a sales order. So if you start to use the asterisk, you'll find that you could sell a raw material, something that's classified as a raw material. And if you do that, the credit should have come from the raw material account. Instead, if you use the asterisk and you point that to the finished goods account, well, a raw material item will disappear out of inventory, but the dollars will disappear out of the finished goods account, and that is not what you want to have happen. So in that case, I would recommend no asterisk for sales orders, and then you just, you fill out all the distinct entries that you need to fill out, okay? So one example where a wildcard is good and one where it's not so good. Okay, now here are some of the tables. Remember, I told you this was going to be busy. Remember, in our first initial example, we were talking about the P4114 for inventory adjustments. Okay, these groups here, this group 1, all of these programs, here's the program, here's the description. So this is the program that is used when I do an inventory issue. This one's a transfer, this one's for adjustment, this one for a reclass. Okay, here are the typical or the standard doc types that Edwards sets up for these. Okay, all of these DMAAIs are invoked when any of these transactions are done. Okay, so and here is a description of each one of these tables. Right now, again, the purpose of having them here is not to review every one of them and put you to sleep. It's so that if you request a copy of the presentation, you can have these for reference, and they are very handy to have as reference material. Okay, one other thing that I want to point out while we're here is something called a system code. So JD Edwards, in their infinite wisdom, and I do not mean that sarcastically, I mean in their infinite wisdom, this was a very good thing that they did. they set up for all of the modules in JD Edwards, they're all numbered. They have a system code that's associated with it. So in this case, for inventory, the system code number is 41. What you'll notice is that the vast majority of program numbers start with P41. Okay. If you're using E1, you might see something, they might start with R41. But it's the 41 that designates inventory. Okay, so notice all of these start with 41. All the DMAAI table numbers start with 41. If you go to the generic JD Edwards menus, the main inventory menu is G41. Okay, all the reports that you run will be R41 something. Right, those are the canned reports that come with JD Edwards. The file numbers inside the database are F41. Everything that they built around this module has a character code that it starts with, okay, which is very, very handy. So if you just see some program number written in a specification, or you're online looking up something and you notice something that says P41, well, you know it has to do with inventory. It doesn't have to do with accounts receivable, accounts payable. Those have different system codes. So for example, inventory is 41, accounts receivable is a 03, accounts payable is an 04, general ledgers is 09, and it goes on and on and on. Okay. Inventory in our case is 41. You can see how that plays out. Now, as I move forward, okay, here's purchasing, right? So these are the transactions that revolve around a purchase order. So I can receive against it and I can voucher match it. Okay, notice the purchasing system code is 43. Everything starts with 43. These are the DMAAIs that get used. Now, this is not all DMAAIs, it's the vast majority of them and the ones that get used most frequently. There are certainly other DMAAIs that can be invoked by some of these transactions, but they are the oddballs that don't get used all that often. Okay, so remember, inventory was 41, purchasing is 43, okay? Sales, so now I'm talking about doing a ship confirmation, right? It's all system code 42. So these are the DMAAIs for a sales order, okay? And then finally, the last module that impacts our inventory and our DMAAIs is manufacturing. So these are the work order issues, completions, variances, labor hours. All of these are the DMAAIs that get invoked. There's a couple of different system codes that are used here. Okay. All right. So it's good to have these things as reference material. Okay. So here's our second poll question. I'll give you a few minutes. Which system code is represented by the number 42? So hopefully you were paying attention during that last section. And there's system code number 42. Probably wait about another 30 seconds or so. Okay. And you can, if you want, key your answer into the Q&A section. Oh yeah, they're coming through. Yeah, this is good. Thank you guys for doing that. And I admit up front, it wasn't fair of me to do this because you probably didn't know anything about system codes when you signed on to this, and I went through them kind of quickly. Okay, that looks good. So I got some answers, mostly 2s and some 5s. So the real answer, the correct answer is number 2. It is system code for sales. So we can, if we recall, purchasing was 43, inventory is 41, manufacturing was 31 and 32. So these are the modules that are, their transactions impact inventory, hence they use the DMAAIs. That's why we're limited to these 4. Okay, so very good, thank you guys. Okay, let's talk a little bit about line types. Now, a line type is something that occurs on a purchase order or a sales order. It does not appear on a work order. Okay, so work orders are out of the mix when it comes to this. So if you're familiar with, looking up a sales order or entering a sales order or a purchase order, you'll notice that, you create the order header. Then when you get into the details, you have to add lines to it. Okay, part of each line on one of these orders is called a line type. That's one of the fields that has to be there. Okay, typically they are entered automatically. The programs are set up to default something, and if you want something other than whatever defaults in, you have to go and key that in, right? So in the screenshot here, you can see this is the actual line type setup screen that's in JD Edwards, okay? Most of you probably have never seen this before and probably never will, okay? There's no reason to, but there is some information that you should know, in your, knowledge gathering surrounding DMAAIs. This is very helpful to know. Now, you'll just see some of the line types here. There's A, B, B, all these different B1s, the C for credits. And if we went down a full list, we would see the S for stock inventory. Now, an S is a very common line type that's used on sales orders and purchase orders for, receiving in items that you're going to track inventory and for shipping out inventory. Okay. Now, the column here, so these are different attributes, right? So do I want the inventory interface turned on for this line type? Yes or no? Do I want the accounts payable interface turned on? Accounts receivable, general ledger? I'm not even sure what this one is, okay? And what the GL class code is that's associated with it, okay? So if I were to put a new purchase order, I created a new purchase order and I typed in some information and I gave it a line type B, the inventory interface would be set to a B. It would say, yes, turn it, I want this transaction to actually hit accounts payable. I do not want it to hit accounts receivable. I need it to make general ledger entries, right? And here is the GL class code that I want to use for that, okay? The one column out of all of this that we really want to focus on is this inventory interface column. If it says no, that means that when I transact against that line, there will be no entry in the item ledger. There will be no quantity added or deleted from inventory. It says, nope, I do not want this touching my inventory. If it says yes, then of course the opposite is true. That means whatever's on that line has to be a valid item number in the item master. When I receive it in, it has to have a location set up. I'm going to create an item ledger record for this transaction, and I'm going to change the quantity on hand accordingly. Okay, so that's what these codes mean. And if you look here, here's more of a definition of what the line types are and where the GL class code comes from, right? So if I enter and I use this particular line type, right? If I use a Y or a D, it's going to come from the item location file, because a Y or a D, and D is for direct ship, means it has to be a valid item. It has to have a branch. It has to have a location set up for that, okay? And that location will have a GL class associated with it. If it's an N, okay, it comes from the fold of the line type. Now, this is an old world term, the fold of the line type, when you used to have to press a function key to see all these values. But in E1, you should probably update this. It's going to come from the GL offset column. right? So if I change my line type to a percent because it's for sales or use tax, then it's going to use the geo class code of TXTX. It's not going to go to an item master for it. Okay, it's going to default to TXTX, right? So any of the ends you see here, that's the geo class code. That's where it gets it from. All right. So here you can see the different types that it could be and where the geo class code is obtained from. Right. So it's not always, you wonder, where does this come from when I do like a purchase order receipt or when I ship something? I look in the item ledger and I can see the geo class code that was used for that transaction. Well, where did it come from? Okay. Where did it come from? So now you'll see where these things come from. Okay. Ends and A's, this is where it gets the geo class code from. It comes from this listing. It does not come from the item master. Okay. All right, last poll question. If I have a purchase order line and I received and the inventory interface is set to no, where does it get the geo class code from? Okay, so which one of those? And go ahead and type it into your Q&A panel again, so I can get an idea of what you guys are thinking. Okay. Oh, thank you, Harry. Service and warranty management. See, I learned something. Thank you very much. Okay, I see some 4s. And we'll give it another few seconds. Okay. Okay, very nice, guys. And the majority of you have it. The answer is it comes from 4. Okay, with some credit for people who answered number 3. Okay, number 4, that was the intent when I worded the question, but I can certainly see that, if you said the purchase order line, well, guess what? If I enter the PO line and I have it set to end, the geo class is going to default from the line type setup onto the purchase order line. Okay, and then it will be used from there. So technically, it could be 3 or 4 would be the proper answer. So you guys get what I'm saying here, which is the main goal. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to go through some tips. So I've been looking and staring at DMAAIs for longer than I care to admit, but I'll admit it. It's been over 2 decades now. And one thing that we developed or we use as part of RapidReconciler, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, is a concept of a model table. Now, if you are familiar with your chart of accounts, chances are you have a model chart, which basically means you just use it as a template to build off of that. So if you ever need to set up a new chart of accounts, you get the model, you copy it from the model, and then you make whatever minor adjustments you need to make to that instead of starting from scratch every single time. Okay. Now, the same concept applies here in that what we do is we look at an inventory table that we normally use for physical adjustments for PI transactions, which is table 4152. So this chart looks busy, and it is, and it kind of sort of gives you an idea of what DMAAIs are invoked for what transactions that you do, okay? So in other words, in manufacturing, if I do a work order completion, I'm gonna do 3130, okay? The 3120 table for work in process is not listed here intentionally, okay? But the other side would be work in process, the same with material issues, okay? And here's the DMAAIs that are used for variance calculations, okay? Inventory, here are the adjustments, cost changes, issues, reclass transfer, physicals, future costs. You can see the tables that get invoked. Okay, the purpose of selecting one is to say, let me set up this table with all the companies, all the, with document type PI, all of the different geo-class codes that we use in inventory, and let me put their balance sheet accounts and make sure that they are correct, okay? Once I vet that out and I say, I'm happy with the setup in this one table for this one document type, now, whenever I look at any of these other tables, the 3110, 3130, 4122, all the ones that are highlighted, they should look the same or be very, very similar. Now, this is not a 100% rule, but it should be a 98.5% rule, that these tables should look virtually identical, okay? Because it really doesn't matter, right? Remember what we're doing here. If I have an item and that item is a raw material, does it really matter what transaction I do, right? If I'm touching an inventory account, if I'm touching the balance sheet on one side of the transaction, shouldn't that always be the raw material account? Doesn't matter what the transaction is. If I issue it to a work order, shouldn't the credit be from raw materials? If I ship it on a sales order, right? Shouldn't the credit be from raw materials? Okay. If I receive it on a purchase order, shouldn't the debit be to raw materials? Of course it should. So the geo class code to balance sheet account number relationship should be a one-to-one relationship. And then it should be the same relationship in all of these different tables. Now, somebody might come in and they'll say, well, we have all these fancy accounting rules. Well, maybe what you're doing is you're overcomplicating things, at least on one side. Now, I understand on the expense side of the transactions, that's a different animal, right? Because you can, depending on other factors, you're going to want to expense things a little bit differently. But on the balance sheet side, typically it's a pretty straightforward setup. The business units may change, but you'll have just a handful of object accounts maximum. Maybe you have a variety of subsidiaries. But again, the structure should be similar in this. So that's what the whole tip of a model concept, of a model table is all about, right? So I should be able to print this one out. And then if I print out any of these other ones and I match them up, they should look pretty close to being the same, okay? And that will prevent or help you prevent all kinds of reconciling items when you try to do that during the close. Okay, debugging errors. Right, now, if you're on a screen and some of the screens are a purchase order receipt, an inventory issue, a reclass, any of the inventory management transactions, and by that I mean issues, adjustments, transfers, a reclass, those types, you will get what's called it's an interactive transaction, and you will see the error on the screen as you're doing the transaction. So you fill out all the stuff. I tried to do this in our test environment. I made sure that we were using a geo class code that was not set up. And then now you can kind of see what the error looks like. So it says distribution AAI number 4122 invalid, right? So now you know what that means. There's a table number associated there. Okay. It's an standard inventory management transaction because it starts with 41. So that's what an IA is, right? And it says, check for the information, company one, order type IA, geo class code IN99 is not set up. And that's why you get the error. So you will never be able to process this transaction until somebody fixes the DMAAI. Okay, but it tells you exactly what it is. So interactive means I'm doing the transaction and I'm getting the error on the screen as I'm doing the transaction. Okay. As opposed to batch jobs and batch problems. Okay, now if I do a material issue to a work order, I do a work order completion, right? I can do those transactions on the screen. If I have a DMAAI problem, I am not going to see an error on the screen. It's going to process as if it worked, okay? If I do shipment confirmations all day long and I have no DMAAI set up at all, those transactions will process until you get to one of these jobs, right? Either the manufacturing accounting job that processes work orders, or the sales update job that processes the sales order and creates the GL entries and GL batches, okay? That, at that point, the DMAAIs are checked, and then you will get an error that looks like this, but the only way you'll see it is if you run the error report or if you get an output of the error report, okay? So you'll never know that there's a problem, right? Until somebody's trying to close the period, these transactions aren't processing, and error messages are appearing in the work center, but if nobody's looking at it, nobody knows it's going on. So that's kind of the difficulty with batch jobs, is somebody needs to be paying attention to make sure that all these transactions are processing correctly. So here's an example for the manufacturing accounting report where this work order would not post because we had this GL category and cost type. They were not set up in the WIP table, the 3120. Okay. How did I know that was WIP? Like I said, I've been doing this for 20 years. Right? That's how you know, it's just experience. Okay. Now, what I want to do, those are some of the tips. I just want to spend just a few minutes showing you our RapidReconciler product. And the only reason I'm bringing this up is because of a lot of the things that we're talking about. The concept of the model table, knowing how to prevent reconciling items. Those things are in the product itself. So I just want to bring it up for a second and talk about it, and then I'll turn it back over to Brittany. Bear with me one second. Okay. So this is what our RapidReconciler product looked like. And again, just very quickly, it's our tool that reconciles inventory, goods in transit, and received not vouchered. Inside of inventory, we have a integrity section, and inside the integrity section, we have some pre-built reports. So we can come in here, and remember how I said 4152 PI, and in this case, we use doc type 99 as our model. Okay, so we set up a 99 to use as a model. And what that does, is it gives us a cross-reference between all the GL class codes we use and all the different balance sheet accounts associated with them, right? So we have many, many different ones, okay? So that's our model table. So what we do is we vet this out with the end users and we say, is this table correct? Once we are happy with how this table looks, what we do is we go to our DMAAI entry. Now, do you remember the slide that had all those little green boxes on it? And I said, you take the model and you compare it to all of those other ones. Well, this report does that for you. And it says, all right, I'm going to take this 4152 PI and I have the model account assigned with it. Okay. Let me look in all the other ones, the 3110, the 4122, all those other balance sheet tables. And let me compare the account number that's in the model with the account number that's in this other DMAAI. And guess what? These don't match. Okay. So right here in the comment, it says we have a mismatch. The material cost on a W1 is not going to book to the right account, right? So if I do an IM, if I issue material on any item that has an ASGBGL class code, the credit is going to come from 146000. It should not. It should come from 145000. So this DMAAI needs to be corrected. All right. So that is the whole point of doing this table, right? And doing these reports is to take a look at some of your setup and say, how are my DMAAIs going to fail me? Okay. Now notice what you don't see here is you don't see any wildcards. You won't see company 0, you won't see asterisk. And the reason for that is when we put this together, we expand the DMAAI. So if there were wildcards in the original entry, right? We'll go in and find a list of all your geo class codes, and we'll make individual entries for them and get rid of that. And the reason we do that is so we can find errors. So for example, if I had raw material RM01 and I had a DMAAI entry for that, and then I had another entry that had all asterisks in the geo class code and put it to this account. Well, what happens when I set up a new item with a geo class RM02 and the asterisk was pointed to finished goods? Well, when I did a transaction, let's say I received it in and it's an RM02. Well, it's going to go to the DMAAI. It's going to say, oh, I found the asterisk, right? So now I'm going to debit finished goods instead of raw material, because those asterisks are there and they mask the problems. So by expanding this out, we would have an entry here that said, oh, RM02 is pointed to the wrong account, because we would show that it would be going to finished goods in that raw materials. Okay, so that's why we do that. So we go through and do all of that stuff and look for all the potential errors, and we work with you and we say, okay, here's how you fix up your DMAAIs so that you don't have those accounting errors every time you do a transaction. Okay, so that's the whole point of this, right? So it's a quick reconciliation. You can see all the information that you see here, and we would go through all of this with you. But the reason I wanted to bring this up and show it to you is to say a lot of those features and functions that we were talking about with DMAAIs and how you can prevent negative things from happening to you in your system, we have already built the stuff to take care of that here. Okay, so with that, let me turn it back over to Brittany so we can wrap up the session today.
Thank you, Ed. And I will just share my screen here. Give me just a moment. All right, can you see that, Ed?
Yes, I can.
All right,
yes.
Perfect, thank you. I'm just gonna follow up, do a quick follow-up real quick. This is our ERP talk. If you check out erptalk.com, it's a problem-solving forum where you can get your JD Edwards and other enterprise application questions answered, as well as contribute your answers to others' questions. Stay connected with us on social media. All of our handles are currently listed on this screen. You can see our most up-to-date posts on webcast, events, industry insights, and so much more. GSI provides extensive free educational resources, including our weekly educational webcast, our monthly newsletter called a GSI Insider, our online resource center where you can access our on-demand webcasts, white papers, etc., YouTube, and then we have virtual workshops. If you would like to sign up for our weekly email reminders for upcoming events, our monthly newsletter, or to create an account to access our resource center, go to getgsi.com and go to resources and events on the main menu, select your platform, and then select the appropriate link on the right. And with that, we will move on to our Q&A session. Let me see.
I'll take care of that, Brittany.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so Harry asked a question. So when the AAI account and model account equal, does it mean that it's correct or will it even show? And to answer your question, it will not show if it does match. So the report was discrepancies only. And just to expand on that a little bit, it's not just that the object matches or the business unit. We do some other checks too. So for example, if you have something called a net zero, which means that the account number on the balance sheet side, in the balance sheet table equals the account number in the expense table, right? That means that the debit and credit come in and out of the same account, so there's no GL impact. So we want to flush those up to the top too. Sometimes that's done purposely, but sometimes it's done accidentally. So we just want to go through them and make sure that if that's what you intended, that's fine. But if it's not, we're going to want to fix those too. So it's not just the accounts match. There's some other things that we do, trying to prevent as many reconciling items as we can. Okay. There's another question here about RapidReconciler and what versions of JD Edwards it works on. And it works on any version of JD Edwards, whether you're World or E1. You know, we work with you. It's something that's done on your hardware behind your firewall. So we have a web interface, as you saw, but the data is maintained behind your firewall. We have a process to keep everything secure. It's a very good product. It's been around for 2 decades now. Lot of people use it. Okay. System codes. Where do I get a full listing of all the different system codes? There is a UDC table in JD Edwards that has a full listing of all the system codes. It escapes me at this very moment which UDC that is, but it is available in your system. I think if you Google that, I think it should be fairly straightforward to get that answer, but there are a lot of them. There's probably well over 100 different system codes. I don't know them all, but I do know the handful of ones that I need to know. So depending on what you do for a living, you probably only have to remember, just like I said, a handful, maybe between 5 and 10 at the most will get you through your career. Okay. Let's see. That looks like that's it for the questions. If anybody else has a question, could you please type it? We have another couple minutes. I'd be happy to answer them, whether it be about DMAAIs, whether it be about maybe RapidReconciler, or, you know, I probably can't answer any questions about, you know, your weather forecast since I don't know where you are, but, you know, other than that, fire away. Okay, Brittany, that looks like it. I don't see anything else coming in. I'll just say that it was a pleasure doing this with everybody this afternoon. I have fun doing it. Hopefully you learned something. And thank you very much. You want to, anything else, Brittany?
Nope, I think we're good. Thank you, everyone. And especially Ed, thank you for conducting this webinar today. It had a lot of great, useful information. So we appreciate you.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.
All right.